I'd like to introduce former President Obama, former Vice President Biden, former President George W. Bush, former President Dick Cheney, former President Bill Clinton, former Vice President Al Gore, former President George Bush, former Vice President Dan Quantrill, former President Ronald Reagan, former Vice President George Bush, former President Jimmy Carter, former Vice President Walter Mondale, former President General Ford, former Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, former President Richard Nixon, former Vice Presidents Spiro Agnew and Gerald Ford, former President Lyndon B. Johnson, former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, former President John F. Kennedy, former Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, former Vice President Richard Nixon, former President Harry S. Truman, former Vice President Alan Barkley, former President Franklin D. Roosevelt, former Vice Presidents John Nance Garner, Harry A. Wallace, and Harry S. Truman, former President Herbert Hoover, former Vice President Charles Curtis, former President Calvin Coolidge, former Vice President Charles Dewey, former President Warren G. Harding, former Vice President Calvin Coolidge, former President Woodrow Wilson, former Vice President Thomas R. Marshall, former President William Howard Taft, former Vice President James S. Sherman, former President Theodore Roosevelt, former Vice President Charles Fairbanks, former President Will McKinley, former Vice Presidents Gerald Garrett Harbert and Theodore Roosevelt, former President Grover Cleveland, former Vice President Alden E. Stevenson, former Vice President Benjamin Harrison, former President Benjamin Harrison, former Vice President Levi P. Morton, former President Grover Cleveland, former Vice President Thomas Hardins, former President Charles Arthur, and former President James A. Garfield, and former Vice President Charles Arthur, former President Rutherford B. Hayes, former Vice President William Wheeler, former President Ulysses S. Grant, former Vice President Schuyler Colfax and Henry Wilson, former President Andrew Johnson, former President Abraham Lincoln, former Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, former Vice President as well Andrew Johnson, former President James Buchanan, former Vice President John C. Breckinridge, former President Franklin Pierce, former Vice President William King, former President William Millard Fillmore, former President Zachary Taylor, former Vice President Millard Fillmore, former President James K. Polk, former Vice President George M. Dallas, former President John Tyler, former President William Henry Harrison, former Vice President John Tyler, former President Martin Van Buren, former Vice President Richard M. Johnson, former President Andrew Jackson, former Vice President John C. Calhoun and Martin Van Buren, former President John Quincy Adams, former Vice President John C. Calhoun, former President James Monroe, former Vice President Daniel D. Thomas, Tompkins, former President James Madison, former Vice Presidents George Clinton, Elizabeth Elbridge Gurney, former President Thomas Jefferson, former Vice Presidents Aaron Burr and George Clinton, former President John Adams, former Vice President Thomas Jefferson, former President George Washington, and former Vice President John Adams!